Welcome to the Influence Experiment, where we seek to explore the art and the science of building influential capacity. Every month, we want to raise thought-provoking ideas of how you can be an investor of the influence you carry. If you're ready to journey with us, then it's time to experiment.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Influence Experiment as we continue to learn how to invest our influence well. Well, today we are talking about conflict, confrontation, and resolution. Most of us, if we're being honest, feel incredibly uncomfortable with conflict. We would rather be doing almost anything than dealing with conflict. And to make matters worse, when we decide to deal with conflict, we usually don't even handle it that well. Why are we so bad at conflict and confrontation? How is resolution possible when there has been deep hurt? What are skills needed to traverse conflict discerningly? If conflict is unescapable reality, how can we tactfully utilize it to aid us in our relationships, our leadership, and our influence? In order to help critically think through this topic, I have invited Doc Ayers to join us. So Doc, thank you so much for joining us today.
It is great to be here, Tony. Thanks for the invitation.
It is my utmost pleasure to have you. Honestly, I feel quite honored to be able to sit with you and process a conversation that, honestly, you have taught me quite a bit about. And so, Doc, would you be able just to share a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you're about before we dive into our conversation today?
Sure. Just to give you the view from 30,000 feet, started my adult life in law enforcement, which was my passion early on in life. God shifted my direction after several years into the business world, and learned some lessons from that, and eventually found my calling, so to speak, in ministry. And during 45 years of ministry, both as a layperson and in full-time ministry, I've been a senior pastor, I've been a youth pastor, been an interim pastor at I believe 7 different churches over the years. I have been engaged in education for, let's see, now 29 plus 6, 35 years.
Come on.
At 2 different institutions, and that's where our paths crossed, and I've counted it an incredible privilege to be able to learn from and with students and to invest in their lives. Yeah. During that experience.
Yeah, and I am just, I think it's just so incredible with the experience that you've had in life, and professional experience, ministry experience, personal experience, and where our lives intersected as a professor, and getting the chance to learn from you with one of my very first classes, Fundamentals of Leadership course, and how my life was crazily challenged and changed because of that, and then as a personal nod to my marriage and how you got to just the honor, and I loved it that you got to marry Beth and I, and just you mean so much to us. And so once again another reason why I'm just honored to be able to sit with you is you've worn many hats in my life. And so as we kind of dialogue and step into this conversation of conflict, confrontation, and resolution, before we started recording, we just talked about how timely this is and how timeless it is, and there is always a need to talk about this because, as we said in the introduction, there's a lot of people who don't do a really good job at it.
Yeah, we didn't get very far in the Bible. We're not out of first couple of chapters in Genesis when conflict erupts, and we've been feeling the implications of that all throughout the history of mankind. Absolutely. And it's not going away on this side of eternity.
Oh my goodness. And it feels like, I feel like everyone says this, but like, it feels like it's just getting worse. Now I'm sure maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it continued is to be a rampant issue. And so, before we dive in, would you be able to share with us, just to break the ice here, a time when there was conflict that seemed massive in the moment, but in reality, it wasn't all that big? Does something come to mind for you?
When you told me that you were going to ask that as kind of an icebreaker, my mind almost immediately went back to marriage. My wife and I were married very young. We were both teenagers. She had just graduated from high school. I had graduated 2 years before her. So I, of course, was so much more mature at that stage in our lives.
Naturally.
And the conflict came over ice cream. In her role as a wife, one of the things that she took leadership in was doing the food shopping for our family. And she knew that I believe that ice cream is a major food group.
Yes.
And it's one of life's necessities. She knew that, and she always wanted to make sure there was ice cream in the house. But she only ever bought one flavor, the exact same flavor, every week.
Every time.
Every time. And so I finally, after a couple of months, I raised the question, why do you only ever buy chocolate marshmallow ice cream?
Ooh.
Which
sounds delicious.
Well, it is. But not every day,
single time,
every week,
no variation,
every month. Not when you've got Baskin-Robbins choices.
Naturally.
And her response was, "Well, that's your favorite." And I said, "That's not my favorite." And she said, "Well, the first time I ever asked you to pick up some ice cream, that's what you bought." And I said, "Well, yes, that was the flavor that was on sale. It's not my favorite." Well, she felt like a mortal failure as a wife, and it led to a little bit of anxiety that was completely unnecessary. And so it was just a foolish miscommunication about ice cream. And that would probably be one of we laughed about it for many, many years after that. But that was easily resolved with the next trip to the grocery store.
That is.
I wish all conflict could be that easily resolved.
I, as silly, funny, trivial, whatever that may be, like literally something as small as ice cream can cause conflict.
Absolutely.
And and yet the heaviness of it is that if that causes conflict, my goodness, what everything else can cause conflict as well.
Yeah.
And so as we dive into this conversation, what would you say are some of the reasons why we run from conflict when we know deep down we should be dealing with it?
There are several thoughts, and I'll just kind of give a quick bullet list. I think one of the primary reasons is we just don't know how to respond. We can't talk about conflict without understanding that so much of it is rooted in good communication skills. And when people aren't taught, or they haven't learned, or it hasn't been modeled for them how to respond appropriately, we try to remove ourselves from uncomfortable situations or conversations or conflict.
Yep.
Sometimes it's related to personality differences, and different people respond to conflict, and they just want to try to escape any conversation or any situation that might potentially be threatening to them. We've also seen the damage that it does sometimes, and it forces people to kind of pick a side or to be pigeonholed or stereotyped. And some people don't want to put themselves in that situation, and so they avoid it at all costs. I think sometimes it's a personal insecurity, that a person is just not confident enough to actually say what they mean and mean what they say.
Yep.
because they're afraid of the repercussions. There may be fears that I might be wrong and somebody else might be right, so there's that element that, who wants to be wrong and make a fool out of themselves in front of other people. And the last thing I would just mention that came to my mind is that the emphasis in our culture today is on free speech, and we hear that hardly a day goes by that's not a topic somewhere in the news or somehow. But free speech that ignores the understanding that free speech should lead to good communication is just so it's so misunderstood by people. Yes, there is a reason for and a foundation of free speech, but that doesn't give us license to insult people, to hurt, to say hurtful things, to call names, to throw a fit, and it can escalate from there. You know what I'm saying. Well, I don't need to give any illustrations. Everyone has their own.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's so, even the last part about the free speech that leads to good communication, I feel like we, in America specifically, we really are so gung-ho about our free speech that we, to the detriment of others, we, whether it's intentional or unintentional, we hurt people because it's not based off of good communication, humble communication, etc. But even the other things that you've listed off here are I think I would say are very accurate reasons as to why we run from conflict. We don't like conflict. We cringe at it. We get anxious over it. And even the 5 or 6 that you listed, there's a lot more that other people would say as to why they don't like conflict. And so there's much to be anxious over it, or there's much heaviness that kind of comes from it. And so what would you say are some of the short or long-term effects or dangers for not dealing with conflict and kind of thinking in an interpersonal way and an interpersonal way? Yeah. What comes to mind?
Well, it's somewhat related to to what we just talked about, but it creates a danger of division. It's avoided because someone is afraid that they're going to end up on the wrong side, because inevitably, if you allow it to go unattended, it's going to lead to someone having to agree or disagree with a topic, a subject, a person, a interpersonal situation, and it alienates instead of unifies. And another long-term effect of it is just we allow sometimes ignorance to be perpetuated. And if I could just take a minute and take that a little bit deeper.
Yeah, please.
I think there's a continuum, Tony, that people don't think about, and I just summarize it in 3 different words. I think there are precepts which you and I would probably call absolute truth. There are foundational things that are always true. Those are precepts. Then there are principles. Sometimes we refer to them as proverbs. One of the books in the Bible. Proverbs are generalities. That's what a principle is, and we can draw principles that are helpful, but that's different from a precept. A precept is right and wrong. It can be that clear. But a principle is something that generally can. It's kind of like the guide rails on a highway. Yeah. But then the third category, and this is the one that usually gets us in trouble, are the preferences. Yeah, you've got precepts, you've got principles, and you've got preferences. And so preferences involve our choices and our opinions on things. But when we don't qualify our personal preference as such, and we try to make our preference somebody else's precept, and say you have to either agree with me or disagree with me, and that makes you right or wrong, that gets us into a lot of trouble. And so in terms of long-term effects, again, that's very divisive in my thinking. Another effect is that it raises a lot of questions about things that are hidden, and these are really matters of the heart for an individual, because we don't deal with conflict sometimes because we don't know where it's coming from. We don't know if is this coming from a place of power play? Is this coming from someone's ego? Is it coming from the buildup of other things that are going on personally? Is there a hidden agenda? You and I don't have the opportunity or the wisdom, knowledge of what's going on in the heart of a person. And so short-term, long-term effects of not dealing with that, it leaves questions of the heart unanswered, which will lead us later on into talking about conflict resolution and trying to get to the root cause of why that conflict is occurring. Misunderstanding of cultures would be another long-term impact. It perpetuates a misunderstanding or an insensitivity. And I think one of the things that is most frustrating to me is sometimes it just allows people who are abusers, particularly verbal abusers, if they're not confronted, they just continue to go on abusing people. We've all heard that little ditty, "Sticks and stones will break my bones."
But words will never hurt me.
But words will never hurt me. No, but words do break hearts. Words do leave scars in people's lives. And for those of us who are trying to be influencers, that's all the more reason that we really need to do our homework on the very subject that you picked for today.
I think that, and you hit so many really good things right there. And one of the two things that stuck out, number one was you would say misunderstanding of cultures. That could be a whole nother podcast episode in and of itself, understanding the differences and nuances between cultures and misunderstandings, because like that is where a ton of conflict comes into play. So I just want to, I guess, make a notation just for myself to say I want to do that as a podcast episode one day. But the part that I think that is really practical for us to think through is, you said that 3 different almost tiers of precepts, of principles, and preferences. And I think that so you were so accurate to say that so often we will take our preferences and we will treat them as precepts and truth, objective truth to other people, when it's just a preference or even a principle, and that a lot of conflict can stem from some of those misalignment of conviction to misalignment of the communication of those precepts, principles, and preferences. So I think that's a really good way for people, for us to think even of how are we navigating our own convictions. And so I think that's really helpful framework to, even as we keep moving forward right here. And so what are some of the ways conflict and confrontation should not be handled? Please enlighten us. How should conflict and confrontation not be handled?
Well, because a lot of times conflict occurs and we're blindsided by it. I think that's one of the reasons why someone smarter than me said that our first reaction is either fight, flight, or fright. Fight, flight, or fright. So one of the ways not to handle confrontation, and this is really difficult, but I don't want to react in the moment, because most of the time my reaction is not going to be a good one. So fight, let's just take each of those real quickly, one at a time. When someone comes at me verbally, and I'm talking primarily about communication now. If someone comes at you physically or in a violent manner, yes, that's a whole different kind of reaction. But in terms of reacting with a verbal fight, emotion escalates so quickly, and it gets completely out of control. And so much of conflict and conflict resolution is emotionally charged. And so defense, self-defense is a natural, it's a natural response because no one likes to be bullied.
Right.
And so then the end goal is someone has to win. Someone they go into protection mode or punishment mode of the person who they're in conflict with. So that's why fighting is not a good response. Flight, of course, that's a quick retreat, but you don't want to avoid conflict either because it's not just going to dissipate or disappear. So just withdrawing from it or retreating from it or complete avoiding opportunities for resolution of the conflict is really not the best choice either. So flight isn't a good choice either. And fright, that's what typically happens when we're blindsided. We freeze, we're kind of paralyzed, we're just, we don't know what to do. We're kind of in neutral, we're stuck. In shock. So sometimes we just can't think that fast. But depending on the situation, you might be forced to react quickly. But if at all possible, that's maybe not the best choice. So what is the best choice then? Acting intentionally, if at all possible. And so we'll get into some of that maybe a little bit more in some of the other questions. Take that a little deeper.
Yeah, and I think that you're again, we're setting up a framework here, and I think that as you said, flight, fight, or frights is I think if we're being honest, we have a disposition towards one of those three, and honestly, a combination of all three at various times.
And that's probably built into us somewhat the way we're hardwired. Based on some experiences that we've had in the past and our personality too.
Yeah. No.
So, and those are things again that will probably come up later in our discussion.
Yeah. And knowing that a huge piece of it is personality and how we are wired consciously and subconsciously to behave and to think, et cetera. And so I think that again, this understanding of these are some ways not to react or not to respond, and yet because we acknowledge our sin nature, because we acknowledge our depravity and our bent towards selfishness, we will go towards fight, flight, or fright. And so we acknowledge these, and I think we need to take a hard look at ourselves of which one of these do we have more of a natural bent to, and how do we resist that side of it. And you used the word, I think you used the word a moment ago, of just intentionality. And so let's kind of go there then. So what are some approaches then for conflict resolution that can show healthy results?
I'm going to start by going back to a well-known philosopher. I think it was Socrates who deserves the credit for describing the essence of communication with three words. And I don't know if you've heard this before, but he talks about ethos, and he talked about pathos, and he talked about logos. Well, just to break that down into simple language, which we're both simple men, I think. Ethos, that's really the moral compass. That's really has to do with the character of a person. So if I want my response and my approach to conflict resolution to be healthy, then I have to make sure that my moral compass is a true north.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, that gets into my relationship with my Savior, and my dependence on the Spirit of God and my knowledge of the Word of God. And then pathos is really more the emotional part of who we are, realizing that, yes, I am made in the image of God with intellect, emotion, and will. I can't discount that emotional part of my being, and that emotional part of my being connects with how I have responded and how I have dealt with experiences in my life, which have been transformative. Years ago, the phrase was coined, defining moments. And there are things like that every single one of us have, which are part of the pathos of what make us human beings. Logos, then, is the part of us that it's the content, it's the information, it's the knowledge which works itself out into our behavior. So the question again of approaching good conflict resolution is going to be impacted by how we think, asking good questions of people who I'm in conflict with, instead of making accusations. I want to nail down what's the root cause. What's this coming from? Is there something deeper than the mere words or the situation? Is there something else that's behind that? I want to understand. I want to be able to engage in a conversation that is civil with a person. And I want to understand their perspective. I want to understand their values and how that is impacting them. So if I'm looking for ways for good resolution, then I've got to look for ways that, if we go back to the former answer, I want to look for ways that I can act responsibly, not react, but have responsible reactions. And that involves a couple of elements, and we could, again, we could go very deeply into some of these, but I want to make sure that the timing is right for me to try to further discuss the elements and the issues that are involved in this conflict. The setting where we do that, some things are not handled well or done well in public. Maybe the setting needs to be different. Maybe the manner. I need to make sure that my own spirit is in check before I pursue a deeper level of trying to resolve this conflict. And in everything, I want to try to affirm the person that I'm in conflict with, because it's usually an issue and not the person. And so what are the things about the person, if I want there to be a good resolution? What are the things that I can affirm about them, about their humanity, about their character, just about the relationship that I have had with them? So I'm looking for common ground. I like something that Max Lucado said a number of years ago, and I wrote it down so that I wouldn't forget to say it today. He said, conflict is inevitable. He said, but combat is optional. Oof. And you see, to me, that's a real powerful. That's a real powerful word. The conflict is inevitable, and I agree with that. Combat, however, is optional, and that's what we want to. If we want good conflict resolution, we've got to move out of combat mode. Yep. And we've got to put down the swords and the shields, and we have to be able to come to a place where we can have good, solid, honest, open communication. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it was great. It was, and even that quote there at the end, that conflict is inevitable and combat is optional. Yeah, that'll hit. That'll be really hard to. That's a hard pill to swallow. Where even the heaviness, that conflict is inevitable. Like it does. Like you can't escape it. So, but also knowing that we have a very intentional choice in how we react to the conflict at hand, and even you addressing the different tiers of the ethos and the pathos and the logos. I think they're more layered understandings of how it's not a simple conversation.
That's right. There's so much involved in this, and to only focus on one of those levels of our humanity is not sufficient.
Right, we'd fall short.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be all encompassing. I totally agree with that. Okay, so the influence experiment is all about finding the art and science of building influential capacity. What would you say is some of the science, some of the objective truth in conflict and confrontation and resolution, and what is some of the art, some of the subjective, individual, personal expression in conflict, confrontation, and resolution?
It might be helpful here to frame this in breaking down the science and the art of conflict resolution by identifying that there are, let me back up half a step. All conflict is not the same. Mm-hmm. And there are three basic categories of conflict. And I think that will address your science and art question, the art and science of conflict resolution. There's what's referred to as substantive conflict, okay. And that really relates to the science. It's science that conflict is over issues which are understood, identifiable, facts, methods, values, ideas. And so, again, a couple of illustrations what might make this very understandable. Substantive conflict, facts. We can, in Christianity, we believe that there is absolute truth. And so if we can identify up front what we understand those truths to be and explain them, that's substantive conflict. When you speak with someone else who says, well, that's not how I understand that verse. That's not what that verse means. Mm-hmm. It's a disagreement or conflict that is more factual. That's not what the Greek word means. We can get into language arguments. In terms of church or any organization, they have a philosophy of ministry or a philosophy of operation which speaks to their methods, their methodology. Mm-hmm. We're doing this to accomplish this purpose, this end goal.
Yep.
Okay? We have values that we honor. And some churches, organizations go so far as to state these are our core values. And again, these are the guardrails, the guide rails, guiding principles that we want to be recognized for, and how we relate to other people. And then there are ideas that kind of touches on the preferences. But if we can identify what those preferences are, then that's okay. So you have discussions in churches that we like this particular style of music, and that's fine to identify that. Where the conflict comes in a substantive way is when people say, well, no, I like hymns. No, I like contemporary music. So we can identify in a substantial way. Yep. That kind of conflict, and it's almost more of an intellectual kind of disagreement. Interestingly, the people who study these things would say that about 80% of conflict in Christian circles falls into the substantive category, which is a little surprising.
Sure.
The facts, the methods, the values, the ideas. Now, the other two are pretty self-explanatory, but they fall more on the art side. Of course, the next one is interpersonal conflict. That's conflict between people. Their feelings, their attitudes, their personal understanding. But when you allow the conflict to go unchecked in a substantive level, then this is where the conflict evolves at the interpersonal level. And so we want to argue about, what does this passage really mean? What's the point of this passage? Well, I don't think that music is worshipful to God, this style of music, because that's not what I grew up on. That's not, well, agree or disagree, it doesn't matter. That can lead to interpersonal. And again, the causing people to kind of pick a side based on personal preferences. Those are interpersonal kinds of conflicts. The intrapersonal, which is the third category, is conflict within oneself. It has to do with the inner feelings. It has to do with my personal beliefs. It has my personal convictions. It has to do with self-esteem. And so a lot of that conflict is buried in a person, and it remains in hiding until something happens that it erupts. So that might help to maybe frame an understanding of conflict resolution in terms of the arts and science of it in a different way. Just one other statement here. Reconciliation and unity are really the art and science combined. Biblically speaking, reconciliation, unity are biblical principles that God gives. We coined the phrase conflict resolution. That's not a scriptural term.
Sure. Right.
But at its root are issues of reconciliation and as well as building unity within the framework of Christianity. However, in many ways, we've lost the ability for people to simply agree to disagree at the interpersonal level.
You are absolutely right. And I think that, now I think I really appreciated again, I'm hoping that in these questions we're putting more like verbiage and frameworks and understandings where to people to help have healthier conversations with others, because even as you were talking about some of the almost the slide of like objective to subjective, you mentioned how there's facts and then there's methods and then there's opinions and ideas and then there's opinions, and like there's this like almost like this sliding scale of like where so often we will take our opinions and ideas and we'll slide them into fact, and that's where a lot of the butting heads comes from, and so on and so forth. And even as you mentioned, from a biblical framework, the idea of reconciliation being a objective concept, and it's something that we ought to be pursuing, where rather we are so quick to find division and we're so quick to find the differences and the things that are offensive to me, rather than how are we being reconciled to each other and pursuing that. So knowing that's a biblical command is something that should be a convicting truth, a fact to us on a daily basis, when in reality it's not as much.
And that's the real motivation for us to want to work through biblical, the biblical basis for conflict resolution. It's so that we can do what pleases God, to reconcile relationships that are broken or where communication is poor, and let the unity of Christ be evident, that we can be very different people, but yet we can all be putting our oars in the water and pulling in the same direction when it comes to the mission of God.
Yeah, yeah, and not to belittle some people's
Sure.
turmoil, conflict, hurts, pain. So again, we're not wanting to have this like, oh, just reconcile, it's okay, or oh, just deal with conflict, it's not the big of a deal. No, there is deep hurt that we want to acknowledge and empathize with, while also not deviating from some of the biblical command or some of just the acknowledging that we can inappropriately cross our opinions and put them into facts. And so, as we continue in the conversation around this, is like, man, are there moments, in your opinion, that we should not run immediately to conflict resolution? Because for me personally, when I've offended someone or I've hurt someone, my knee-jerk reaction is, oh, let me go reconcile right now or yesterday, because it just eats me up inside. And that's a little bit of my personality, eats me up, and I want to go deal with it. But there's an acknowledgement that potentially there's some moments that is it wiser to not run immediately to it? Like, what would you say to that?
I would say that, again, that's a personality difference that is becoming very clear in your personality. You are motivated to let's get this out in the open. Let's deal with this right now, and let's not harbor this. Let's get it straightened out.
Sure.
But other people aren't wired that way, and so you might have one person whose emotions are raging and they're out of control. They're saying something that out of something else that's going on deeper in their life, and that's not the time, because the person is, that conversation is so emotionally charged that I don't want to respond, and we're really not going to come to a good resolution.
Sure.
In that kind of context. Of course, it's probably obvious, but violence, if the conflict is one that is erupting in such a way that there's a potential for violence, or the threat of violence, obviously you do not want to pursue that immediately. You want to do everything you can to dispel that. And I hate to even have to say this one, but there are some times that I've been in situations where someone was under the influence of either a substance or alcohol, or even the influence of another person who kind of put someone up to doing something, where I want to recognize that. I want to expose that. And so I'm going to try to avoid responding immediately to that. So, again, that one may be obvious. If there's a lot of confusion, if it's a very, if it's something that's very complicated, I may need some time to kind of process that. I may need the ability to even process what just happened, and then also I may need to seek counsel. I just may not know how to respond to something that has been done or said. And I need to get some help from someone who can be objective to help me think through what is the proper response. Sometimes there's not enough time in the moment that we throw that phrase around. Well, it's just not the right time. Sometimes that's an avoidance tactic.
Sure. Yep.
But other times that's a very real issue that we need to pay attention to. That to have that conversation or to work through this conflict, there may not be enough time in the moment to do that. I'm going to back off if I know that it's something I need to pray about. I'm going to say, I hear what you're saying. I hear your concern. I need to do some own soul searching. I need to pray before we can really continue this conversation or try to work out this conflict. And the last thing I would mention here is just a thought is sometimes conflict, it occurs in a public forum, and sometimes that's intentional by people because they want an audience. And I'm not going to cooperate with that.
Yeah.
I'm going to move that to a private and say, this is not something that I'd like to pursue here and now with an audience. I'd like for you and I to be able to work through that privately or with the help of someone else. A great illustration of that, if I can just give you one real quickly. I'm not sure what your church experience has been, but in a lot of the churches where I've been a part of, they have congregational meetings. And a congregational meeting, often the floor was open for people to say things, ask things, make comments, and so on. And one individual stood up in that public that public meeting and attacked my character and made some comments that were unfounded, but no one else who heard those things, but he chose a public place to do that.
Yep.
And he was very vocal, and it was heard by several hundred people. And immediately, and I'm so grateful for the godly influence of one of the elders who stood up and said, this is not the time, this is not the way, this is not the place for that to be addressed. If you have a problem with our pastor, you've made an accusation, tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, you're going to meet with all of the elder board and the pastor in the office, and we're going to get to the bottom of this.
All right.
End of conversation. And I was so grateful
Yeah.
that someone else stepped in and removed that from a public confrontation.
Yep.
So sometimes it's just not. You don't want to cater to the person who wants to attract attention or make a statement.
Yep. You have shared a lot of really good insights, and I think I would say that, or I think that this question maybe isn't more particularly for me because, like I said, I have this innate desire. I'm weird. I don't enjoy conflict by any means, but like I'm not afraid of it, and so when there is conflict, I'm like, oh, I want to deal with it right now. But knowing that what you're sharing is that yes, there are moments that's not the best to go guns a-blazing, even in the right intentions of like a reconciliation or dealing with the conflict. And I think what also I heard you say between your words is that social media is not always the place to spout off your opinions about things that rub you the wrong way.
No. Yeah. I knew that sooner or later that was going to come up. And maybe we can pursue that a little bit deeper in some of the other, because I couldn't agree with you more. I think social media has almost become ammunition for some people to say things. It connects to what we were talking about earlier with free speech.
Yep.
Social media of any kind. You can pick whichever one you want: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we can go on and on. Mm-hmm. And we know that's a hot topic right now, that free speech issue. But that doesn't sort out what's true and what's not true.
Yep.
It gives people it gives people a platform to say whatever they want and not be held accountable for it.
Yep.
And to test some of those statements for absolute truth, it becomes very, very difficult to do it.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And so
dangerous.
Dangerous indeed. But again, also not something to completely run away from, where social media does have its place.
Yeah.
Man, what an absolutely packed first episode of Conflict, Confrontation, and Resolution. I hope that you have been challenged by some of these thoughts, by some of these ideas that Doc has shared with us and processed with us. And as we look towards the second episode that will be released in our next installment, that will hit more of the practical, some more of the tangible, and some of the biblical as well around how do we do this with a very tricky topic and conversation. But in the meantime, we do hope that you will take some of these things that we've processed and be challenged by them. And how can you learn to be more intentional and be a person more of communication and a person that looks to pursue healthiness and holiness rather than selfishness and our own entitlement. And so we hope that you will join us next time as we continue to explore the art and science of building influential capacity. Catch you next time.